everybody. Today's community education video, we are talking to Susan Coale, who's the director of the Chesapeake Life Center at Hospice of the Chesapeake. Hey, Susan, thanks for taking time to talk with me today.
Hi, Tammy. I'm happy to be here.
So today's conversation is in recognition of International Overdose Awareness Day, which is on August 31st. And just to give a little background on that, that is the world's largest annual campaign to end overdose. And they remember without stigma those who have died and acknowledge the grief of family and friends left behind. So it's a really important day. And I think, Susan, you have a great deal of background with working with individuals who have lost a loved one due to overdose. And today I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about how COVID has played into all of that. So let's start with that. Talk a little bit to me about COVID-19 and overdose loss. Like what's been your reality with that?
Absolutely. I went online to see, what's up. There's not a lot up this year. One of the things very real and immediate is that the COVID pandemic is impacting how this day can be recognized. Whereas last year, I believe it was virtual. This year, I just recently spoke with someone who is on the committee to organize our local event in Glen Burnie, and they're only going to be able to have 200 people in person. They're not going to have, resource tables around for people. So just even that, to not have, the events that I've been to that they've had before, there's been such a sense of community.
Right.
And the power of feeling literally, and I'm not always big on crowds, but of just feeling all of those people around you. And that is, always in a time of loss and grief, community and support is critical.
Right.
And somehow I think there's a difference for the community of people who have been through the struggle of loving someone struggling with substance use. Yeah. How important community support is for not just those with the illness, but their family members. There are all organizations, NAAA, whatever, for those who are struggling with the disease, but then there are just as many of them for their family members. So community, it's all about community. And then when there's a loss, someone dies and the community really wants to pull in tight, and they can't because of COVID. Even in a community generic way, like for an annual remembrance. So I just think that is just a huge loss.
Right. I hear what you're saying, especially the magnitude of having that experience of seeing so many other people that have gone through something that you've gone through that has felt so isolating. And yet you are, so now to not have that ability to have that experience has to be a real challenge. And my other thought during COVID-19 from the news that I've read is that there've been an increase in deaths related to overdose. So we're now talking even more volume of this experience, right?
Yes. And that part of that is it's this circle, so that there's the isolation, and that can so often be a trigger for using, because that is what, think of the basic tenets of some of these groups. When you have the urge to use, you're to reach out, right, to go to, and not just, the telephone is fine, but right, often it's that face-to-face, eyeball to eyeball that helps people maintain sobriety. Right. And so again, COVID has impacted that. And so because of more loss, there's more loss.
Right.
Yeah,
that's so hard. Is there something that you could share with us that makes grief different, or explain to me how grief is different for someone who has experienced a loss due to overdose versus a different type of loss? What makes it so different?
I think the foremost thing is the stigma that's attached to it. That for families who are struggling with someone who is struggling with addiction, that the families feel that stigma. And all along, it keeps people from getting the treatment and the support that they need. And again, that leads back to why the community of other folks in the same situation is so important. And then when there's a death due to overdose, that stigma carries on for the families and keeps them from wanting to get the grief support that they need. It just, again, it's a cycle over and over. And it's interesting to see how I've also heard from families who are grieving a loss due to COVID, that for some of them, they're experiencing a kind of stigma as well. The sense of shame, like they should have, did they not wear their mask? Did they not have their shot? So that there's a stigma that goes with that. So that when someone who has been using substances then dies of COVID, it like magnifies.
Right. Wow.
That.
Right.
So, that thread of shame and stigma just continues. And again, the value of the gatherings that happen on August 31st to help diminish and decrease that shame. I just think our work to continue to try to decrease, to get rid of that stigma and shame is so important.
So important. Yeah, absolutely. What are some other suggestions that you can make for those that haven't personally experienced the loss of a loved one due to overdose, but may know of a family member or friend or, someone else? What are some things, in addition to just let's talk about it? It sounds like one is one thing to do. What are some other suggestions of how we can support to make that, reduce that stigma?
I think the biggest thing is to just show up and not to force that conversation, but to be available for it. And to have no expectations of that conversation, to be willing to stand by them and hold whatever emotions come up.
Is there a good phrase that you can say? Because I know sometimes it's hard. You don't want to say the wrong thing.
Right.
Is there some good catchphrase that one could use to sort of open that, opportunity?
I think there's always the classic, tell me more. I'm so sorry you have to go through this, which is very broad, because so many families have already been grieving. They've already been their own expectations or hopes for their children or their parent have already, some of them taken away.
Right.
They've already been on this cycle of using rehab, recovery, sobriety, and back down. So they've been through this cycle. So they've been through so much, so that any emotion is possible. And so we shouldn't assume, because I think that's the other thing that I've heard from families is it's like their loved one was disposable or, not all that. I mean, he was an addict.
Right.
Well, seriously, that does not impact the quality, the beauty of that human being, their innate value. But again, part of that stigma, that's what people have felt.
Right.
So to be able to join with someone in remembering the beauty and the goodness and affirming that.
This was who that person was.
Really was. Yes, so much more than just that one descriptor.
What about any other resources, online or books? Are there anything specific to experiencing a loss due to overdose that you generally recommend?
There are some good losses on many of the overdose awareness websites that you can click on. Okay. Another place to go on the web that I have found really helpful is GRASP. It's an acronym, Grief Recovery After Substance Passing.
Okay.
And their website has some really good stuff. They've written a book. It was begun by parents who lost a child to overdose. And they have a book, the title of which I can't pull up at the moment, but they have a book that they've written. There's another one called Lament for a Son.
Okay.
Also online, I think you can Google or search in YouTube for My Beautiful Boy.
Okay.
There's a lovely video tribute to a young man who died of an overdose. So, I know for a lot of people, online is where they want to go. So those are some of them. Once you get to one place, there'll be a book, perhaps a family story that leads you to another one. And so they vary according to what person's needs are. The other thing is Chesapeake Life Center staff a couple of years ago wrote a pamphlet about talking to children after a substance use loss, which is really helpful. And also, What's Your Grief has been a pamphlet, Surviving the Grief of an Overdose Death. And What's Your Grief is a wonderful website to go through for assistance with any kind of a loss.
I think you bring up a really good point about clearly there's a need for helping children to kind of move through their grief and process what happens when there's an overdose loss. How can somebody access that? Would they just call the Chesapeake Life Center to get that information?
Okay. Yeah.
The other thing I know that that Chesapeake Life Center does so beautifully is really help support the community with grief groups, with individual therapy, what's happening. And I know virtually you all have stepped up to be able to offer those services virtually as well. Can you fill me in if there's anything coming up in the future that somebody might be able to use?
Yeah, actually we have a group that will be in person. It's small, it has to be limited, but that begins on October the 26th, I believe it is, and runs for 8 weeks. It's a Tuesday evening. As I say, it's in person, it's very small for folks who've experienced a traumatic loss, and an overdose loss is by its very nature a traumatic loss. So that will be in person. We also have a 6-week group coming up. We have parent loss, child loss, other groups that are either virtual or in person, or sometimes both. We have a spousal loss group that meets both ways.
Okay.
So, and all of those, it's amazing. Over the years, there are folks who have experienced an overdose loss in almost all of those groups.
In those categories, yeah.
Those categories. It used to be that folks who had experienced, that specific kind of loss were all together in one group. There was an overdose group and other kinds of divided up by the loss. And it's not that that's not helpful and useful, but I take it as a good sign that we're able to provide an atmosphere that is welcoming and embraces all, so that folks with this loss are sprinkled through all of our groups.
Right. And that's just wonderful that there's that support available for them, because as you said, part of the stigma is the isolation. So to be able to find somebody else that really can understand and relate is huge.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that we didn't touch on today that you feel needs to be shared regarding, just being aware and the International Overdose Awareness Day?
When I was looking at websites and was reminded of the tagline, a time to remember, a time to act. And I thought, what a wonderful sort of succinct way it is to remind people that we need to remember. That's a part of our grief process. We need to remember our loved ones in all of their aspects, all of their foibles and all of their beauties. We need to remember them and honor them. And how people die does not change who they were and how beautiful and wonderful beings they were. So that remembrance is really important. And sometimes it's painful. but we have to face that and do that. And out of that is where we can then figure out how to act, how to make meaning from that, how to make that death not have been in vain. And when I think of the people that I've walked with, how they've gone through that process, they have remembered, they have grieved, they have felt the pain. And out of that, that has given them the energy and the direction to act on behalf of others, whether it's simply listening to other people and encouraging folks and doing what they can to decrease the stigma in that way, or whether it's going out and being an activist and, working on these large events. All of it, that just encapsulates all of it, to remember and to act.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Susan, for taking time to talk with me today about this. I know it's just such an important event, an important recognition, and something to do. So thank you.
Thanks, Anna.
I also want to be sure to thank the John and Kathy Belcher Institute for their generous support of the community education programs at Hospice of the Chesapeake. Thanks.